I never learned about this stuff in school.
Well, maybe that's because we're Canadian, but...
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we learn a lot of American history. I'm not sure if Americans learn about our history or not.
I highly doubt it.
Probably not.
Not a lot goes on here, gotta be honest.
Yeah, it's pretty boring compared to these. Some are very dark and some are just very strange events.
Yeah, I put some weird ones on here, because why not?
If there's anything that you think we missed on this list, I would suggest going back and looking at some of the other videos we've done. Because I feel like there's some that I left out because we've talked about them before. So we're trying to do like fresh stuff, but there's so many weird moments in American history. In the spring of 1866, just over a year after the Confederate surrender marked the end of the Civil War, Memphis, Tennessee became the stage for a horrifying display of racial violence known as the Memphis Massacre. Over the course of 3 days, from May 1st to May 3rd, a white mob unleashed a brutal and unsolicited attack on the city's black community. Many of the victims were people who had served in the Union Army. 46 people had their lives taken and more than 75 were injured. Adding to the atrocity, the mob attacked and essayed 5 black women. The rioters also destroyed a significant portion of the community's infrastructure, torching between 50 and 90 homes and approximately a dozen churches and schools. This violent outburst wasn't just a display of sheer brutality, it was also a stark indication of the deep-seated resistance among Southern whites to accept defeat and adapt to the new social dynamics that included black Americans as free citizens. The Memphis Massacre stirred a wave of national outrage and empathy, particularly catching the attention of the US Congress. It underscored the dire need for legal protections against such racial violence, significantly contributing to the push for the 14th Amendment, which aimed to secure citizenship and civil rights for those who had previously been enslaved. Ratified on July 9th, 1868, this amendment became a cornerstone in the ongoing battle for civil rights in America. This tragic event in Memphis was among the first major racial massacres during the turbulent Reconstruction era, a grim precursor to the similarly devastating New Orleans massacre just a few months later on July 30th, 1866.
So from August to mid-September of 1944, a series of gas attacks were unleashed by a mysterious assailant in Mattoon, Illinois. The case was never solved. Residents reported a prowler who would spray gas into their homes, causing symptoms like nausea, paralysis, and vomiting. Now, some aren't even sure if there really was an attacker, or if this was just a case of pollution combined with mass hysteria. I mean, it was wartime after all. The first incident took place on August 31st of 1944. A man named Urban Rafe woke up to this strange odor in his home. He became nauseated and weak, while his wife found herself partially paralyzed and unable to get out of bed. The next evening, Aline Kearney smelled a sweet odor in her home, which soon became overpowering. She lost feeling in her legs and called for help. Her husband later reported seeing a tall man in dark clothing fleeing the scene. And more reports followed, with several other residents reporting similar experiences. On September 5th, Carl and Beulah Cords found a cloth with an unusual smell on their porch. Beulah became violently ill after sniffing it, having a swelling and burning sensation in her mouth and throat. A skeleton key and a tube of lipstick were also found nearby, but apparently that didn't have anything to do with the case. Over the course of the next couple weeks, all these other reports started coming in about people seeing a prowler or smelling gas, but no one was ever caught, and then the reports just kinda stopped.
Next, we are talking about Mary the elephant. Mary, who was an Asian elephant weighing a hefty 5 tons, found herself tragically entwined in one of the darker, often glossed over episodes of American history. She was a star performer in the Sparks world famous shows circus until a fateful day in September of 1916 when she killed her inexperienced handler, Walter Red Eldridge, in Kingsport, Tennessee. Red, who had just started his job and had previously been a hotel clerk, not really sure how he made that jump, met his gruesome end after reportedly provoking Mary by prodding her with a hook. According to one witness, Mary reacted violently, grabbing Red with her trunk, slamming him against a concession stand, and then fatally crushing his head beneath her absolutely massive foot. Listen, I'm definitely not one to victim blame, but what did people think was gonna happen? I mean, it's not necessarily a surprise that something like this occurred. The reaction to the tragedy spiraled into absolute chaos. Reports fueled by sensationalism and fear varied in their accounts, and some even incorrectly claimed Mary impaled Red with tusks that she didn't have, as female Asian elephants are typically tuskless. I guess they didn't have Google then though, so I wouldn't have known that either. The public outcry was immediate and fierce, with onlookers demanding her death. The circus' precarious situation, compounded by threats from towns against hosting them if Mary was included, led to a very drastic decision by circus owner Charlie Sparks. Mary was set to be publicly executed. On a grim, foggy day, over 2,500 people gathered as Mary was hanged from a railcar-mounted derrick. The first attempt horrifically failed, snapping the chain and causing her to fall and break her hip, sending people scattering in terror. A second attempt finally ended her life. It was later discovered that Mary had been suffering from a severe tooth infection right where Red had prodded her, a detail that casts a heartbreaking shadow over the already extremely grim story. Didn't know I could get so sentimental about an elephant, but Mary deserved better, man.
All right, this next one, more gross than it is dark, but an incident called the Kentucky meat shower was just too enticing to pass up. I mean, how yummy does that sound? The Kentucky meat shower. So on March 3rd, 1876, in Bath County, Kentucky, chunks of what looked like red meat started falling from the sky, and it lasted for several minutes. One farmer's wife had been outside making soap when she saw pieces of meat start to fall. It was a good time to be making soap, I guess. She described it slapping the ground around her. The pieces of meat were about 2 by 2 inches. Some were larger, about 4 by 4. They thought it was beef, but there was only one way to find out. Put that mystery meat that just fell from the sky in your mouth and give it a taste test. 2 men arrived on scene and taste tested a couple chunks and said it tasted either like lamb or deer, but one health specialist said it was likely a type of bacteria that can swell into this jelly-like mass when it rains. Problem with this theory is that it hadn't been raining at the time. Not regular rain, anyway, it was raining meat. It wasn't even overcast at the time. So a sample of the meat was then sent to the Newark Scientific Association to be analyzed, and a researcher named Dr. Alan McLean Hamilton said the meat seemed to be lung tissue from either a horse or a human infant. Other samples of the meat seemed to be muscle, cartilage. Now, what likely happened here is that a bunch of buzzards had vomited the meat. Buzzards are known to sometimes regurgitate when they feel threatened, so maybe a bunch of them were flying overhead, got scared, and started tossing stuff up, creating a shower of partially digested meat. Yum.
On the chilly night of January 24th, 1961, the skies above Goldsboro, North Carolina witnessed a harrowing episode that nearly altered history as we know it. A Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was performing a routine airborne alert mission. Loaded with 2 colossal 3.8 megaton Mark 39 nuclear bombs, the aircraft encountered a critical failure, a fuel leak that escalated rapidly. Major Walter Scott Tulloch, the pilot, made a decisive call to return to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base for an emergency landing. Unfortunately, the situation deteriorated swiftly and the B-52 began breaking apart midair. Major Tulloch then ordered his crew to eject at 9,000 feet, which ended with 5 crew members landing safely, but sadly 1 member perished upon impact and 2 others passed in the wreckage. This is already disastrous, but more peril awaited in what fell with the plane. Those 2 nuclear bombs that it was carrying, in case we forgot. As the aircraft disintegrated, the bombs were ejected, taking a dramatic fall towards Earth. In a miraculous twist, neither of the bombs detonated. Imagine if they had. Life as we know it would be completely different. Actually, none of us would probably be here right now talking about the Kentucky meat shower. Information on this near catastrophic event didn't become declassified until quite recently, actually, but when it did, it revealed even more terrifying information, like how one bomb was a mere safety switch away from unleashing a catastrophic explosion. This dark, often overlooked chapter of American history underscores the razor-thin line between safety and disaster, especially during the nuclear-armed Cold War era.
Kentucky meat shower sounds... It sounds like something gross. You know? I'm gonna give you a Kentucky meat shower!
Oh my god.
The death of Gloria Ramirez is one of the most horrifying and puzzling cases in American history. On February 19th, 1994, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez showed up at Riverside General Hospital in California. She'd been experiencing severe heart palpitations. Her breathing was also irregular, and she seemed confused and out of it. Her condition just continued to worsen, and as doctors worked to save her, they began noticing unusual things. Her body had this oily sheen to it, and there was a strange odor coming from her mouth. When one nurse drew her BLOOD, she said it smelt of ammonia. It also had yellow, brownish particles floating in it. The nurse suddenly fainted, followed by a doctor. They felt lightheaded and nauseous. When a third doctor collapsed as well, it was clear something was very wrong, and almost the entire emergency room was evacuated. Aside from a small team who stayed with Ramirez trying to stabilize her, but she died within 45 minutes. Her kidneys had failed, which was linked to cervical cancer that she was aware she'd had. But that didn't explain the 23 people at the hospital that fell ill, some very severely, after coming into close contact with her. So what happened? Well, it looked like she'd been using dimethyl sulfoxide as a home remedy for pain caused by her cancer. When paramedics administered oxygen to her, it converted to dimethyl sulfone, which can crystallize at room temperature, which would explain the odd particles seen in her BLOOD. And when hospital staff used electric shocks to defibrillate her heart, it could have converted to dimethyl sulfate, which is highly toxic, explaining why doctors and nurses started passing out.
The Barbary Wars were an early conflict faced by the fledgling United States as it tried to assert its sovereignty on the global stage. Imagine American ships freshly independent from British rule navigating the treacherous waters near the Barbary coast, today's North African coast, only to be harassed by local corsairs, the pirates, and privateers of their day. These maritime menaces demanded tributes for safe passage. When Thomas Jefferson ascended to the presidency, he refused to play this costly game of high seas blackmail. Instead, he led the US into an unlikely alliance with Sweden, sparking the First Barbary War between 1801 and 1805. This conflict reached a dramatic climax when a daring band of 9 US Marines and 500 Allied mercenaries stormed the city of Derna in Tripoli. This bold maneuver not only marked the first time the US flag was hoisted on foreign soil, but also ended the war. However, peace was short-lived. After the War of 1812, President James Madison found himself dealing with renewed hostility as the corsairs resumed their attacks, violating the earlier peace treaty. This ushered in the Second Barbary War, a swift 9-month skirmish that effectively ended major piracy in the region. While these confrontations are often overshadowed by other historical events, especially at this critical time in the birth of US history, they were crucial in establishing US naval power and independence in international waters. The Barbary Wars were a dark and gritty saga of high-stakes diplomacy and bold military strategy.
The Philadelphia Experiment. In late 1955, Carl M. Allen, an ex-Navy merchant mariner, sent an anonymous package containing a copy of Morris K. Jessup's book, The Case of the UFO. He sent it to the U.S. Office of Naval Research. Now, inside the book were all these handwritten notes discussing things Jessup had talked about in his book, like UFO propulsion technology and alien races. Allen also noted that he felt the author of the book was getting too close to apparently uncovering their technology. Allen then started sending a bunch of letters directly to Morris K. Jessup, warning him not to continue investigating the levitation of unidentified flying objects. He also described a secretive experiment called the Philadelphia experiment. Allen claimed to have witnessed this experiment while serving aboard the SS Andrew Forsyth. According to him, in October of 1943, a destroyer escort was made invisible at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard and then teleported to Norfolk, Virginia before reappearing. Jessup's life then took a downward turn after receiving Allen's letters. He ended up taking his own life in 1959. Allen seemed to disappear soon after.
The 1960s were a tumultuous era marked by the escalating tensions of the Cold War. At the heart of this global standoff was North Korea, a nation shrouded in mystery and ruled by leaders who were as idolized at home as they were misunderstood abroad. Known colloquially as the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea's ties with the Soviet Union lent it considerable, albeit shadowy, influence. This influence was often manifested in ways that strained its relations with the United States. One of these provocations, a relatively obscure yet chilling episode, occurred in April 1969. This was shortly after President Richard Nixon took office, a leader known for his staunch anti-communist stance and a knack for geopolitical strategy. Nixon's method of playing communist powers against one another, famously highlighted by his groundbreaking visit to China in 1972, was just beginning to take shape. However, his diplomatic awareness was put to a severe test when North Korea shot down an EC-121 American spy plane over the Sea of Japan. This incident could have spiraled disastrously. It left Nixon enraged and brought the world perilously close to nuclear confrontation. In the heat of the moment, US military forces, including Air Force pilots stationed in South Korea, were placed on high alert. One pilot, Bruce Charles, was even tasked with the very grim responsibility of potentially dropping a 330 kiloton nuclear bomb on North Korea. As tensions reached a fever pitch, Nixon and his advisors deliberated their next move. The decision to stand down from a nuclear strike may have apparently been influenced by Nixon's state at the time. Reports later revealed by historians suggested that he was actually significantly inebriated at the time. This episode is not only a testament to the fragility of international peace during the Cold War, but it also highlights a less discussed moment in American history where the specter of nuclear war loomed large over a single volatile incident.
I'm gonna finish things off with the most literal sense with a strange phenomenon that happened in 1780. The Dark Day, a day where the sky went mysteriously dark. And not just overcast, it was basically nighttime. It started out like any other day, but by mid-morning, an unusual darkness began to creep across the sky, and by noon the darkness was so intense that candles were needed to see indoors. Farm animals returned to their barns thinking that night had fallen. Other animals were confused. Frogs started croaking at 2 p.m. The darkness stretched across parts of New England and even into eastern Canada. It lasted for a while. Things didn't clear up until the next night. At the time, nobody had any idea what was going on. They thought it was the end of the world. And for several days before the dark day, the sun appeared red and the sky looked yellow. So the likely cause of the dark day was smoke from large forest fires. Researchers studying tree rings and fire scars in Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario found signs that there had been a massive fire in 1780, and the smoke from these fires caused the darkness. Yeah, some fire.
All right, guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been one of your hosts today, Olivia Kozlowski.
I've been your host, James.
We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.